As with the capitalization lectures, I'm not going to cover everything there is to know about numbers, but this is a good start. Now, the majority of this presentation is again based on the material in the Copy Editor's Handbook, but know that Editing Canadian English has a really comprehensive chapter again on measurements. And that one is chapter 8, starting on page 145 of Editing Canadian English, 3rd edition. And it really gets into some nitty-gritty stuff here. Most of this stuff you could go ahead and edit your whole life and you might never come across the majority of it. But if you're editing a document, particularly if it's scientific or if it includes any sorts of measurements at all, this is really valuable information. And this chapter covers everything from latitude and longitude to inches versus centimeters, and also things like times and not just typical times, but the 12-hour clock versus the 24-hour clock, and Canadian time zones, and so on and so on. So lots of really great stuff in Editing Canadian English. So again, these are really vital guides for editing. So there can be a lot of confusion about when should I use a word and when should I use a numeral. In general terms, even in the time that I've been editing, the last, whatever it's been, 10, 15 years, I have noticed a progression from words to more numerals. This might be something that has happened generally because of internet usage. It might have more to do with periodicals. I'm really not sure, but that's the trend that I've seen. So just be aware of that. And of course, various style guides are going to vary. CP is going to be different than, say, Chicago, because they have a different audience generally. But there are some things that you should know. So you never want to begin a sentence with a numeral. So you have a couple of choices. You can reword the sentence or you can spell out the numeral. So you wouldn't want to say 1998 was a disappointing year for wheat exporters. But you could say wheat exporters experienced a disappointing year in 1998, or you could spell out 1998. Most technical and scientific publishers, along with newspapers and magazines, prefer numerals. Most technical style guides prescribe spelling out only whole numbers less than 10 that do not represent precisely measured quantities. So think about that for a second. That would be 0 to 9, but when it is not a precisely measured quantity. So there's a bit of a subtle difference potentially there between 9 cups and 9 sheep. And then there would be also a situation where you would want to make sure that you're being as consistent as possible within a particular document. So important to know that. Here's a good example. We performed 5 experiments within a 6-week period. These are 2 different usages, but at the same time, you would want to consider consistency. So we performed 5 experiments within a 6-week period would be probably a better choice. In non-technical texts, such as novels and trade paperbacks, the convention is to spell out whole numbers less than 101, so 0 to 100, except percentages, years and dates, page numbers, and chapter numbers, and to spell out large numbers that can be spelled out in 2 words. Okay, so this is a common convention, but I've noticed recently, I believe within the last 2 editions, that Chicago Manual of Style has changed its position from this being a hard rule to it being a sort of a soft rule. So know again that we are moving towards more numerals, and so understand the conventions of the organization that you're working for, or understand what the possibilities are for the genre and audience, and then make an informed decision based upon that. So here are some examples of what you might expect if you were editing a scientific or a technical document. The ages might be listed as numerals, particularly if you are editing a scientific document, whereas if you are writing a non-technical or editing a non-technical document, you would spell them out because they're all aged 9 and under. In a scientific or technical document, you would write the numerals for 73 million kilometers. Now, you wouldn't write out all those zeros. You would rarely write out all the zeros because that's very cumbersome in any document. Now, there are cases where you might want to write out all the zeros for specific mathematical documents, and perhaps scientific documents if it's a very precise number. But in this case, when you're talking about 73 million kilometers, we can intuit that that's probably an estimated distance. It's probably not precise. In humanistic or non-technical documents, it's likely that you would spell out that type of a number. And the same goes for using abbreviations and numerals when you're talking about a speed in scientific or technical documents. So in technical and non-technical documents, so basically everything, all numerical values of the same class or type are treated similarly in the text. So this is about consistency. So we ran 5 trials in January, 9 in February, and 12 in March. So even though 9 and 5 might normally be spelled out, because you're going to use numerals for 12, you have to make a decision. Is it going to be spelled, or is it going to be a numeral? And in this case, for a technical document, it makes more sense to keep it as a numeral. In non-technical documents, the same is true. So how do we know what to capitalize, or what to spell and what not to spell? Well, we're going to stick to specific categories. So next year, 325 local officials will attend the national meeting. It makes sense to use a numeral for something like 325. And then if we've already used a numeral for numbers of people, then we're going to continue to do that, 28 and 2 delegates. But 2 days is a different category or class or type. So days, the number of days and hours is different, so we can spell that out. Avoid 2 unrelated numerals in a row. And in the next example, you can see why you would want to avoid that. In 1968, 125,000 marchers protested the decision. It doesn't sound so bad when I read it out loud, but when I look at it, it's a bit confusing. It's a bit it's a bit confusing to the reader. So you want to avoid something that might make the reader go, oh, that's bizarre, what do I do with that? And it's easy enough to recast it. In 1968, about 125,000 marchers protested the decision. So in this case, clarity trumps concision. And also usually use a comma to set off the last 3 digits of a 5-digit numeral. Now, the key word usually, know your style guide.